Robbie Robertson finally opened out on one of his life's most agonizing and protracted conflicts, his fallout with Levon Helm, prior to his passing in August 2023. It was more than just a band. They played key roles in the band. Among the most significant bands to emerge from the late 1960s and rule the 1970s. They had the same stage, sound, and spotlight for years. Then, almost without warning, things took a turn for the worst. A decades-long schism that followed both men far after the band's heyday and even after the last waltz in 1976 began as a quiet strain. Robbie eventually addressed the true reason for the breakup before he passed away, and many were surprised by what he disclosed. What exactly did Robbie Robertson say, then? And why was there never any resolution to this feud? Let's examine every detail. The slow-burning dispute started inside the band. Some of the most memorable tunes of the 1970s came from the band. Decades later, records still sound warm, lived in, and somehow honest. Despite the music they produced, the group's internal lives was never as simple as it seemed on vinyl. The end was not where the cracks began. Long before anyone referred to it as a conflict, they were already there, silently forming. Something had changed by the time the last waltz's last chords were played in 1976. They maintained their smiles for a bit too long. The discussion ended abruptly. And everything fell apart practically immediately after the curtain dropped. Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson experienced a breakdown that would eventually solidify into a lifetime rift. However, there was a completely other narrative prior to the hatred, blame, and decades of animosity. Far from sold-out arenas and farewell concerts, it all started years ago. Prior to becoming the band, they were the Hawks, a rough-and-tumble Toronto-based supporting group for rockabilly vocalist Ronnie Hawkins. The longest-serving member was Levon Helm, who joined in 1957 and became the band's full-time drummer after graduating from high school in 1958. He carried Southern beat into chilly Canadian venues during his lengthy voyage from Arkansas to Ontario. Others fell into place one by one. Richard Manuel, Rick Dano, and Robbie Robertson. Hudson. Stan Celeste was also involved for a while. Hawkins managed a tight ship and was a master at band building. He assimilated potential musicians rather than competing with them as they emerged on the scene. He took Robertson, Dano, and Manuel under his wing as a result, and they played night after night in Hamilton and Toronto. Hawkins's performance served as a test. Rigorous schedules with no shortcuts. You either picked things up quickly or didn't survive. Hawkins, Helm, and Robertson started appearing frequently at Pop Ivy's Summer Garden Pavilion in Port Dover, Ontario, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Hawkins pulled 17-year-old Rick Danko into the fold after spotting him playing at the pavilion in May 1961. Hawkins and Hawks members saw Richard Manuel and his band, the Rebels, for the first time at the same location. That was a memorable occasion. Hawkins soon found himself in charge of Manuel's team. He also persuaded Manuel to depart and sign with the Hawks by September 1961. The most difficult person to win over was Hudson. He had a plan and a college degree, unlike the others. Instead of chasing club gigs, he wanted to teach music. For him, rock and roll was a pastime. Nevertheless, the Hawks were unable to overlook his contributions. His playing on the organ was powerful, unafraid, and entirely original. Hudson eventually consented to join after several requests, but only under certain conditions. He would teach music for $10 a week, paid by each member. They would purchase a high-end Lowrey reorgan for him, and he would be consulted on all matters pertaining to music theory. It was structure, not arrogance, and it gradually established a tone that would be important in the future. They recorded a few singles with Hawkins and became known as the tightest rock band in Toronto's flourishing scene. Even after the club lights came up, rehearsals continued. After lengthy performances, Hawkins frequently insisted on all-night practices, forcing the band to hone their skills out of pure need. However, there was a price for the control. They became agitated over time. They have had enough of performing the same songs. They desired to pen their own. Hawkins' management approach also became stale. Concerned that bringing girlfriends to performances might reduce the audience, he penalized them. It was highly forbidden to use marijuana. The regulations accumulated. The liberation evaporated. The rupture was imminent by the end of 1963. They eventually parted ways with Hawkins due to personal disagreements. And they were alone for the first time. They went through names as if they were trying on different personas. First, saxophonist Jerry Penfound momentarily extended the Levon Helm sax. They became Levon and the Hawks once Penfound quit. They returned to Levon and the Hawks for a recording session with Atco later that year after releasing a single in 1965 under the moniker The Canadian Squires. They met blues icon Sonny Boy Williamson at about the same time, and they wanted to be his supporting band. The plan was never carried out. Shortly after they met, Williamson passed away. Then the pivotal moment arrived. They were hired by Bob Dylan as his backing group for his U.S. tour later in 1965, and then for the controversial 1966 World Tour. Dylan assisted them in moving to Sagerties, New York, when that storm passed, where they recorded the casual, private sessions that would eventually become the Basement Tapes. Big Pink's 1968 music was influenced by those tracks. They were just known as the band by the locals in the Woodstock area. The name, according to Levon Helm, just fit. It remained in place. They were formally known as the band starting in 1968. Dylan would later work with them once more, most notably on their joint tour in 1974. At first glance, everything appeared to be going according to plan for success. However, the group's internal equilibrium was already changing. The roles were shifting. At first, lines were drawn softly, and the tension increased as the song continued. It was there, waiting, but it hadn't exploded yet. You have to go back to the point at which everything escalated in order to comprehend how that tension developed. Go back to the year that Bob Dylan made the decision to destroy his reputation and bring a band along. Inside the band's ascent, notoriety, drug use, and the conflict that turned everything around. Bob Dylan was prepared to destroy his own reputation by the end of the summer of 1965. He wanted a band that could handle the heat with him as the folk prophet was set to go electric. Not yes-men, not session players. An actual band. The Hawks and Levon were highly recommended. John P. Hammond, a blues singer, understood exactly what Helm, Hudson and Robertson could achieve because he had already collaborated with them earlier that year. At about the same time, Dylan was encouraged to see them perform at a club on Yonge Street by a friend from Toronto named Mary Martin, who worked as Albert Gman's secretary. It hardly mattered if it was the Friar's Tavern or the Locked Door. Her determination was what counted. Dylan needed to see these men. He made a quick decision after that. Dylan asked Helman and Robertson to be his supporting band after listening to them perform and speaking with Robbie Robertson. However, loyalty was still important back then. Helm and Robertson returned to Dylan after just 2 performances and clarified something. They had no intention of abandoning their band. Dylan had to take them all if he wanted them. Dylan concurred. It seemed like the chance they had been working for years at the moment. Greater visibility and larger stages. They considered themselves to be a polished, well-rehearsed rock and rhythm and blues group. For them, Dylan remained primarily an acoustic protest singer. They were yet unaware of how well-known he would become or how disgusting the blowback would be when the amplifiers turned on. They began a relentless tour in September 1965 and continued until May 1966. Dylan took the stage electric night after night, and the response was harsh. Folk purists were jeered. They jeered. The band was viewed as though they were accomplices to a crime. Frequently fueled by chemicals, Dylan reportedly relied heavily on amphetamines to keep up with the pace. A few Hawks drank from the same excess. Others observed it. Levon Helm was unable to tolerate it. He was deeply affected by the animosity. He left the tour completely after a little more than a month had passed. He disappeared rather than merely taking a step back. Helm worked on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico during that period, remote from yelling crowds and heated discussion, while the rest of the band continued to tour. The fracture was the first significant one. Silent but telling. Dylan and the other Hawks attempted to record in between tours, but it was difficult. Songs languished, studio sessions lingered, and development was excruciatingly slow. Dylan eventually became so frustrated that he moved the sessions from New York to Nashville in an attempt to gain momentum. Robbie Robertson's guitar was very audible during those sessions. Most of the others weren't there. Although it wasn't yet referred to as partiality, things were beginning to take a different turn. Europe followed. Dylan and the Hawks performed at Manchester's Free Trade Hall in May 1966. A single word that would reverberate for decades was screamed by a crowd member near the end of the Electrified set. Judas. Dylan turned to the band and instructed them to play it loudly after pausing, responding that he didn't believe it and calling the voice a liar. What came next was unadulterated, angry, and rebellious. Music was no longer the only thing. It was conflict. The machine stopped completely 2 months later. Dylan suffered injuries in a motorcycle accident on July 29, 1966. Tours were cancelled. The momentum vanished. In Woodstock, New York, Dylan slipped into semi-seclusion. In an attempt to survive, the Hawks wandered back to roadhouses and taverns, supporting anyone in need. Everything felt unsure once more for a moment. Dylan then gave them a call back. He invited them to Woodstock at the beginning of 1967. A big pink mansion outside of town was hired by a number of members. Big Pink was the name given to it. It was not well-planned or polished. Songs started to appear haphazardly. Without any pressure, the tapes rolled. It was casual, personal, and subtly innovative. Helm was absent at first, but his presence filled the room once more when he came back. The Hawks had stopped serving as anyone's backing band by the end of those recordings in late 1967. They started taking their writing seriously and creating something unique. They were still without a name. The story of how it eventually stuck varies. A few names were shot down and floated. Some were half-jokes. They eventually adopted the name that everyone had already given them. The band was formed by them. They made a big splash when they made their debut in 1968. Critics praised it. The musicians listened. The sound of the music was rooted, aged, and older than the time period in which it originated. Success came soon after. Festivals, larger spaces, tours, and louder applause. However, success wasn't distributed equally. The imbalance within the group increased along with the attention. Robbie Robertson started to assume greater power, direction, and control. It seemed essential to him. However, there were other ways in which the group was falling apart. Drug usage was becoming more widespread. There was a decline in reliability. Not all of them were singing anymore. Levon Helm had a different perspective. Helm perceived it as a tightening of power, avarice, and the taking of something instead than sharing it. The accusations persisted even if they hadn't yet exploded. Heavy, silent, unsaid. Parts of the band were internally hollowed out by addiction. They continued to advance despite being proclaimed kings by the outside world. As the music grew darker and the lyrics began to express worry, albums and tours followed. Peace did not come from fame. It made the edges sharper. From the outside, the band appeared unstoppable by the early 1970s. Tension was seething inside. Nobody had yet to back down. Nobody was prepared to acknowledge the extent of the change. It was no longer subtle, but the fracture was there. There was not a single disagreement nor a dramatic outburst that led to that fracture. It arrived gradually, driven by weariness, bitterness, and an increasing awareness that the path was demanding more than it was providing. They had not been brought together by fame. Every difference had been amplified by it. Finally, someone had to make the final decision. Silently, then suddenly, that time arrived. How brother turned against brother after the last waltz. Robbie Robertson was exhausted by the middle of the 1970s. The romance of the trip had faded. After Northern Lights' Southern Cross didn't land as planned, touring felt risky. The band had to perform in theaters, secondary markets, and smaller venues where it was impossible to ignore the contrast. This was no longer the relentless ascent. It was survival. By 1976, a large portion of the tour felt condensed intense, concluding in locations that subtly but unmistakably conveyed the band's current position. In the end, ZZ Top was given an opening slot at the Nashville Fairgrounds. A moment that demonstrated how much had changed. Soon afterward, everything began to tilt even further. Richard Manuel had a severe neck injury in a boating accident in Texas at the beginning of September. In addition to shaking the group, it intensified a thought that had been simmering inside Robertson's head. It was no longer sustainable to tour to him. It seemed careless. He advocated for the band to cease live performances, suggesting a farewell show that would, at least in theory, end the chapter amicably. What followed became legendary. The band performed their farewell waltz at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco on Thanksgiving Day 1976, following a final televised performance in late October. As the band performed, 5,000 people were fed turkey dinners. A segment of horns was arranged with care. Many of the guests on the all-star lineup have been a part of the band's history from the start. Ancient ghosts, old mentors, and old collaborators. The mood was less joyous behind the scenes. Robertson's longtime buddy Martin Scorsese recorded the performance. Additionally, it had a sense of finality from the beginning that not everyone in the group had approved of. It seemed like a farewell to some. Others perceived it as a predetermined choice. The band's album Islands, which fulfilled their contract and made it possible for the final Waltz movie and soundtrack to proceed, was published the next year. It was the original lineup's last studio album. At about the same time, more performances were filmed for the movie, which was then incorporated into the video along with interviews. The Last Waltz was presented as a decisive conclusion as well as a concert by the time the documentary was aired in 1978. That framing was never accepted by Levon Helm. Helm later expressed his opinion that The Last Waltz had never been decided by a group of people in his autobiography. He saw it as Robbie Robertson's project, carried out according to Robertson's specifications and motivated by Robertson's vision. According to Helm, the split had been imposed rather than mutually agreed upon. Ownership was never denied by Robertson. Years later, he admitted that he had made his point with the movie and the album, and he was willing to accept that if other people didn't think it was their point. He was content if it remained just his view. He had no misgivings about claiming it because he thought the movie spoke for itself. The band's reality was decaying behind the spectacle of the parting. Each member was having some sort of difficulty. Drugs, alcohol, fatigue, a lack of trust, and dependability. According to Robertson's later account, he felt as though he was standing within something that was already burning. And knew he had to leave before it collapsed entirely as he watched their musical abilities fade away in real time. There was more to The Last Waltz than just song. It recorded the expense. Long enough for the camera to capture it. Hands that wouldn't stop shaking, hollowed faces, and bodies that had been pushed past their breaking point. Richard Manuel's situation was unavoidable. In order to maintain his composure throughout a performance, he occasionally required drugs. There was nothing concealed. Nobody pretended it wasn't taking place. It unfolded in plain view and was captured on film for eternity. The damage hardened rather than diminished when the lights went off. The band's internal fractures did not mend after the movie. They enlarged. Whatever hope there was for a genuine reconciliation slowly vanished. In March 1978, following a solo performance by Rick Dano, the original five did make one final appearance on stage together for an unscheduled encore. It was fleeting, brittle, even tentative. There were no statements or speeches, just music and then quiet. Then it was permanently over. Closure was not what came next. It was a loss. In 1986, Richard Manuel took his own life. A few years later, Rick Dano left in 1999. Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson's distance from one another never closed. They were formerly inseparable, but after the split, they hardly spoke at all. Time went by. Decades piled up from years. Helm's rage had always required a target, Robertson admitted as he turned around. Eventually, it was him if it wasn't the manager, the agency, or the attorney. Helm was so deeply resentful that he declined to go to Dano's burial. If Robertson would be present. That was the extent of the situation. But something changed just at the end. The two guys reunited in 2012 as Helm's health deteriorated. Later, Robertson revealed that he went to New York and spent a lot of time sitting with Helm in the hospital. He thought about the music and the connection that previously seemed indestructible as he recalled the amazing, lovely times they had spent together. He told of being greeted with warmth by Amy, Helm's daughter, whom he had known since birth. He said that Helm was one of the most remarkable talents he had ever encountered and that he had always felt like an elder brother to him. He expressed his gratitude for the opportunity to see him one more time and made it apparent that the love had never really faded. At the age of 71, Levon Helm passed away on April 19, 2012, due to complications from throat cancer. Over 10 years later, Robbie Robertson came next. He battled prostate cancer for a year before passing away in Los Angeles on August 9, 2023, at the age of 80. There was ultimately no clear-cut solution. Together, these two men created something timeless. Only when there was nearly no time left did they find peace after years of being unable to stand in the same room. Feuds don't always have a dramatic conclusion. Simply put, they run out of life. Why didn't Robbie Robertson refer to it as a feud with Levon Helm? Throughout all the years they spent together, Robbie Robertson refused to believe that his relationship with Levon Helm was characterized by a quarrel. Not at all. Not in the tidy, dramatic manner that people later liked to describe it. This term stuck because it was practical, simplifying a complex concept into something more easily understood. They had history, a rich history that endures despite the dissolution of things. Robertson kept returning to the same reality whenever he was questioned about Helm. Helm was, in his mind, the closest thing to a brother he had ever encountered. Their connection went beyond music. It overflowed everything. The creative and the personal were so intertwined that it was impossible to tell them apart. Robertson thought that their ability to create something that no one else could ever match was precisely due to their closeness. The friendship was nourished by the music. The music was nourished by the friendship, but it was beautiful, but delicate because it all shared a small space. Robertson maintained that bond was something valuable even after everything fell apart. There was never, in his opinion, a feud in the conventional sense. He did not witness two men engaged in combat. He observed that Helm was having personal, financial, and mental difficulties. Robertson thought Helm fell into habits that made it hard to hold him accountable in the years following the band's heyday. Because of habit, not because of cruelty. He believed that resentment had a way of finding another place to land and that Helm struggled to look inward. According to Robertson, two people must be actively swinging during a fight. He didn't think that was what was going on between them. However, mutual consent is not necessary for tension to increase. Both men had lived near danger long before the money, the credits, and the resentment. Their story never included drugs as a side note. They were incorporated into its fabric. In the beginning, drugs clouded judgment and recklessly united the group. They hollowed things out later. Dependability diminished. There was less trust. What started out as a sense of collective rebellion gradually turned into a source of stress, particularly as every flaw was accentuated by success. That pressure did not suddenly explode. It simmered. Robbie Robertson's life had always been complicated. Rosemary Dolly Chrysler, a Kaga and Mohawk woman who grew up on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve close to Hamilton, Ontario, gave birth to him on July 5, 1943, as Jamie Royal Robertson. Later, she worked at the Carraro jewelry plating factory in Toronto's Cabbagetown neighborhood, where she met and wed James Patrick Robertson in 1942. They raised their only child while working long hours and relocating through various Toronto neighborhoods. When Robertson was younger, his mother would frequently take him back to the Six Nations Reserve to see relatives. He was first captivated by music there. He learned to play the guitar from his older cousin, Herb Mike. The remainder was filled in by the radio. Late nights spent listening to voices crackling in from Buffalo and Nashville, rock and roll seeping through static, and rhythm and blues floating across borders. He was made by those sounds, not just amused by them. When I was 12, everything changed once more. Robbie's mother revealed the truth about his biological father while she was divorcing James Robertson. Prior to her marriage, she had a relationship with Jewish-American gambler Alexander David Kligerman. Before Robbie was born, he had been killed in a hit-and-run. She soon made plans for her son to meet his paternal uncles. They made sure he felt like family by swiftly assimilating him into their world. It was an additional layer that was added too soon, another lesson in conflicting allegiances and intricate relationships. Childhood was not the end for those patterns. They followed him into adulthood, influencing his relationships, commitment, and control guarding. Relationships were never easy by the time Robertson reached adulthood. Although love and loyalty were important, they frequently coexisted with ambition, detachment, and a desire to lead rather than follow. At the peak of the band's success, on March 24, 1968, he wed Canadian journalist Dominique Bourgeois. In the midst of the craziness of touring, popularity, and creative pressure, they created a family together. They had a son, Sebastian, and 2 daughters. However, the same factors that caused tension in the band also caused tension in the marriage. The strain of leadership, long distances, and creative focus all had an adverse effect. Another link that failed to withstand the imbalance was the divorce that followed the marriage. Robertson discovered an alternative form of collaboration years later. On March 12, 2023, he married Janet Zuccarini, a Canadian restaurant tour operator, top chef, and Canada judge, after 4 years of dating. It was more private, quieter, and focused more on grounding than momentum. Those close to him believed that their marriage was deliberate, even though it happened only 5 months before he passed away. A man who chose to remain still after decades of movement. Robertson dedicated himself to causes that aligned with his principles, even outside of his personal connections. He supported public awareness campaigns and anti-racism efforts by leveraging his position as a member of Artists Against Racism. It was just another manifestation of the same spirit that pervaded both his leadership and his music. The ones closest to Robertson were shocked when he passed away early on August 9, 2023. Although his official cause of death was never made public, it was claimed that he had been fighting prostate cancer for approximately a year. Until his wife took him to the hospital the day before, he appeared to be doing fairly well, according to those close to him. His wife, his ex-wife, and his kids were all with him when he passed away. Robertson's 3 adult children sued his wife in May 2024, claiming elder abuse and undue influence. The lawsuit claims that during a time of severe health deterioration, legal documents were signed that would provide her with financial support following his passing, purportedly without his children's full knowledge or consent. Once more, the narrative focused on authority, trust, and who has the right to speak when others are unable to. The conclusion was well known. Because it was simpler than the facts, the feud narrative persisted. The reality was messier and slower. Brotherhood, drugs, ambition, and silence bind these 2 men together. One who thought that the only way to prevent everything from burning down was through structure. Someone else thought that structure was stealing something necessary. Neither entirely correct nor entirely incorrect. They didn't ruin one another. The version of themselves that used to fit together was outlived. And there was no easy way back when the music eventually stopped. How do you feel about Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm's feud? Tell us in the comments section below. Remember to subscribe, like, and share. Click the following video that appears on your screen as well. You'll have fun.